Good morning. Now, resuming with Mr. Calderwood.
Yes, Lord.
Good morning, Mr. Calderwood. No, Mr. Connell.
Thank you, Lord. And good morning for me also.
Good morning.
I'm going to turn now to the bone marrow transplant unit move from the Beatson into the new hospital. In part, and this may be my fault because although you deal with this in various places in your statement, I'm perhaps struggling to get them in some kind of order. So what I'm going to do is first of all suggest to you that, and I don't need the detail at the moment, I'm just wanting to see if you understand, if you accept what I'm saying, that there were a number of stages. Obviously, the first stage is, should we move the bone marrow transplant unit into the new hospital at all? And I'm not concerned with that stage. We've had evidence about that. We've seen papers on it. We don't need to ask about it. So the first question is, well, what was done, as it were, to prepare the new hospital for the arrival of the unit, which hadn't been originally envisaged? The next stage happens around the time of the official opening. In other words, issues arise, and I won't go into the details at the moment. So stage two is issues arise, and a decision has to be made as to whether the unit stays in new hospital or goes back to where it came from in the Beatson, at least for the moment. So that's two stages. Then there's perhaps what I might describe as an intermediate stage, while attempts are made to see if things can be done of one kind or another to improve the position. And then finally, there is the decision which happens, I think, after you left, which is ultimately whether it goes back in. Now, do you agree that these are the right stages to look at?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, if we can start then by looking at your witness statement again at page 44 and running on to 45. Now, on page 45, you say the environment in Gartnavel, so that's the old Beatson, correct?
Yes, that is the Beatson West Scotland Centre, which was opened in 2008.
The environment in Gartnavel was, what would be the right phrase, more appropriate. The patient had a stronger specification, 4B didn't. At that point, money was made available to the project team and the operational directors to bring across the environment in Gartnavel into 4B. Now, am I right in understanding from that the first stage was to say, in effect, we need to see what environment these patients require. One way of doing that is to look at what they've got in their existing location and then try to bring that across, as it were, into the new hospital, correct?
Correct.
And that's essentially what you're saying there.
It is, yes.
Now, if I can just then diverge a moment from the witness statement, we've subsequently heard evidence, which would be after you prepared this statement, from Mr. Gavin Jenkins, that he and the hemato-oncology consultant and the ward manager all went to see the project team on several occasions in order to explain to them what was required to accommodate their cohort of patients and what they had in the Beatson. Now, first of all, assuming that to be correct, is that what you would have expected to happen?
Yes, once the board accepted that the adult bone marrow transplant unit, which is a small component of the Beatson West of Scotland service, should be co-located with acute adult facilities and in particular critical care. The board then instructed at the time the regional director, Jonathan Best, to proceed with regard to affecting the inclusion of these patients in the new hospital. My expectation would have been very similar to that point you've just made, that they would meet with the project team, they would get an understanding of what 4B was being constructed to, which we touched on last night with the employer's requirement statement that we saw. And from there, they would give advice to the project team of what further enhancements would need to be made. And to that extent, funds were released by the board to the project team to make these enhancements.
Now, just so that I'm keeping up, Mr. Calderwood, when you say the employer requirements that we discussed yesterday,
Yeah.
what you have in mind is the clinical outcome.
The clinical outcome specification that we saw last evening.
Yes, which related to not the bone.
No, not the bone marrow transplant into the
transport,
the hemato-oncology service.
But the then located in the Southern General hemato-oncology service.
Yes.
Right. Sorry, Mr. Calderwood.
No, the reason I'm asking about this, Mr. Calderwood, is there is a gap that is not addressed in your statement. Not because you've forgotten about it, but because it probably hasn't arisen at the time. And that is this, and I want to ask you about it. Assuming that what you expected to happen, happened, which is what Mr. Jenkins tells us, and he tells us who went and who they met and so on and so forth. And assuming that he then tells them what is required, then the question is, why was what he conveyed, he and his colleagues conveyed to the project team, apparently not built? I
have no idea. In fact, I've not heard it expressed that there, in that terms, that there was, in fact, in the spring of 2015, a suite of rooms handed over which didn't meet the enhanced specification that we had agreed with Multiplex.
The reason I ask is this, that the step that you envisaged, i.e. a communication from, let's just say, the Beatson,
Yes.
to the project team saying, this is what we need.
Yes.
Here are the details, write it down, whatever you need to do. You thought that's what was happening. Now, when questions arose, when difficulties arose, however you want to put it,
Yeah.
At the time that patients migrated into that unit, did you try to find out whether what you expected to happen had happened?
No, not until later. The building, and in particular this clinical service, transferred as part of the migration across the site because the project team and the commissioning officials said it was fit for purpose and patients moved. It first was brought to my attention that it wasn't fit for purpose when the new hospital-based infection control team deemed that it wasn't suitable for these highly compromised patients. And at that stage, I set about the process of trying to identify what was the deficiencies that the infection control team were raising. At no time, to my knowledge, did the clinicians, the cancer clinicians, ever come to me and say, the rooms that we are in are not to the standard we asked for. I've never heard that statement before.
Right. Can really just secure that point. My understanding, and I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, of Mr. Jenkins evidence was that the clinicians, and indeed he as a manager of the unit, identified that what was provided at the Queen Elizabeth was not what they had made clear to the project team that was what they had at the Beatson and what they had told the project team they required at the Queen Elizabeth. Now, that's my understanding of the evidence. I do see from your statement that your focus is on the infection prevention and control clinicians. But my understanding of Mr. Jenkins' evidence is that it was the clinicians and managers from the Beats who pretty well immediately realized that what was being provided was not what they'd asked for. Now, is Mr. Collins, do you share my understanding of evidence we've heard?
I have no issue with that at all, Maud. I think the reason I'm asking you this now at the start of this passage of evidence is that I suppose what I was trying to get at, if it had been anticipated that there would be an information exchange, tell the project team what you to do. And this was done, we are told, as you had anticipated. I'm just trying to find out why, during all the various toings and froings, no one seems to have raised it with you, and you don't seem to have asked about it.
Well, if we could take it in stages, in 2013, the then Regional Services Director, Jonathan Best, signed the change control order. That was the order that we being the board, through the project team, raised with Multiplex to say, please do these additional works at an agreed cost of X. And that's one of the documents you have shared with me through the preparation for this inquiry. That signed, in old speak, that buying order to buy additional. So I go back to some of the points we touched on last evening. At the time of handover in February 2015, the project team should have carried out a series of tests to confirm that the individual rooms, and in particular the specific high-risk areas, were to specification. Then during the 3-month plus commissioning period, the clinical teams should be assuring themselves that the environment was to their specification. If the clinical teams were of the view in day one that these rooms were not to the specification that they asked for, then with all due respect, I would have to say they should never have moved. There was no requirement on the board to move them. Unlike the Western Infirmary, where we were moving the hospital out, therefore everything had to go or stay, the Beatson was not in that critical path. So if the doctor said in day one, it is not right, they should have stayed at Garnavel. And Mr. Jenkins, with all due respect, a good colleague of mine, was in charge of that move. So if he was saying they were not right, he should never have moved.
Well, I understand that. Can I come to one point you just mentioned? Can we just look at bundle 16, page 1699, to try and understand the role of this document? Now, this is the change order.
Yes.
Signed by Mr. Best. Now, I think, I'll be corrected, no doubt, both Mr. Best and certainly Mr. Jenkins, who was shown this, thought that this was a kind of initiating document, if I can put it that way. This document didn't specify everything that was needed because that communication hadn't happened yet. This was simply a starting point And that's what prompted Mr. Jenkins and his team to go over and have something like 5 or 6 meetings with the project team to go over the details. And you described it as a buying order. So from your perspective, did you understand this to set out everything that was required?
Well, personally, until this was shared with me in the preparation for my witness statement, I'd never seen this document before, nor would I have expected to see it. When I read it in the opening paragraph under description of change, I thought it was fairly comprehensive in the context of what they were asking for. To say that this was the start of a narrative, then I can't argue with that. But if you read it in detail, it includes a definitive cost of £840,000 as a quote valid until the 10th of July 2013. That reads to me as works, i.e. conversations had taken place between the project team, the regional directorate and multiplex to arrive at these are the changes we want, and this is the cost, and the board made the cost available. Now, if Mr. Jenkins is saying, yes, but that was only day one, we wanted that 850,000 plus more, then there should be another document at a later date adding more. And I'm not saying there isn't, I'm just saying I've never seen it. And if Mr. Jenkins has it, then that's absolutely fine. So my starting point would be the document we saw last evening, plus this put together, should have been the schedule against which this area was tested before acceptance for multiplex. And this is a standard that the commissioning team should have achieved before saying that it was safe for the patients to transfer.
Right. Well, we asked Mr. Jenkins about this, and we have his evidence on it. And we asked Mr. Best about it as well. Mr. Jenkins didn't draft this, nor did he and his consultant team from the Beatson and management team from the Beatson draft it. So what he says, we can only go on what he says. He says they go over and they don't get any, let me use that colloquial phrase, pushback. They go to the project team and they say, these are the things we need. And the project team apparently make note, certainly don't reject anything that's proposed. Don't say to him, well, you can't have any of that because it's not within the change order or any such thing. They simply spend considerable time going through all the requirements, and then he hears no more.
No, I'm not disputing that. I think the point I'm trying to make is the paper that the board received, setting out the clinical arguments as to why the service should move, the fact that betterment would need to be achieved, and would the board make the money available. That was a process I was involved with the board and approved. Mr. Best was the Regional Services Director. Mr. Best and the Chief Operating Officer signed this change control, which represents a starting, I'm not arguing that this is a total, I'm just saying that starting point. Mr. Jenkins became the Regional Director after Mr. Best. If he's saying that in 2014, in preparation for the move, he and his clinical colleagues wanted more, then there's nothing wrong with that, but there should be a process. He should be able to point to a document where the project team recorded their needs, showed negotiation with multiplex, and showed a similar buying, in my phrase, buying order for that additional works. So leaving that to one side, I can't comment on that because I wasn't party to it and I haven't seen any documentation to the fact that there was such a. But I come to the point in May 2015 when the clinical teams were responsible for commissioning, at no time, either in the run-up to the patients transferring or in the immediate aftermath of the patients transferring, did anybody come to me to say, this is building, this area is not to the specification we asked? Because my answer to them then would have been exactly the same as my answer was to them in the beginning of 2016, which is get out and get back to the beats. And it is not, there's nothing we can do while you are in situ.
It's interesting that you put it that way. We asked Mr. Jenkins whether, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, the series of meetings that he says, and we're checking with the others who are said to be there, should have been documented in some way that we don't have. And he said, with hindsight, yes. However, what he also told us was that when questions started to arise over the facilities in the new hospital, which initially I think were prompted by some air quality tests.
Yeah.
And therefore people started to think, have we got what we wanted? He did two things. First of all, he went back to his two colleagues who were with him during these meetings and said, were we imagining this? You know, can I just check? We did go through all of this, didn't we? And he says he got a positive answer. And then he remembered that they were asked to sign drawings at one stage during the meeting to cover the various things they discussed. So he said, that's fine, we'll go and get them. And was then told, if I remember rightly, that they had been destroyed due to lack of storage space since they were prepared in 2013. So he wasn't then able to, as it were, to produce the material. But if we just bear in mind, please, when we go through what's in your witness statement, that the one part that we have heard about that you hadn't is what Mr. Jenkins told us about all these meetings with the project team, during which nobody said yea or nay, everybody just seemed to be content, and matters he assumed would proceed. Now, whether that was naive on Mr. Jenkins, not for this hearing today, but that's what we've been told.
No, I can't fathom how that would work out. If we're in the same time frame, if he's saying during 2014,
2013, because it was as he got this change order, and then he went. That's when he started the process.
so he's saying that after July 2013, after this work had been instructed, he and his colleagues entered into discussions for more work.
Well, he didn't think it was more work, so just let's not. What he thought was that this was the initiation of a process, and he wanted to know, what do we do next? And understood he would go and meet with the project team.
No, I can understand. I'm not in a position to dispute what he's saying. The point I'm trying to make it is that this piece of work was the end. This document represents the end of a piece of dialogue that took place earlier in 2013 to agree a series of structural and other changes for a cost over and above the original project, to which the board approved. And this is the change control procedure documentation. At this point, in July 2013, Mr. Seaborn was still the project director, albeit Mr. Loudon was there along with him. And so from my point of view in the paperwork chain, there was the original specification that Multiplex had agreed to create 4B2 for a different patient population. This was added to it in the expectation of putting a more complex patient population into the space. And therefore, I would have expected if in the second half of 2013, Mr. Jenkins and the clinical staff enhanced this requirement in saying we need more, the outcome of those discussions would have been an equivalent document being issued to Multiplex. If there isn't a document issued to Multiplex, then there is no instruction for anything to be done. It can't. You having a conversation with me will not result in Multiplex doing anything if we do not instruct them.
Does this document go to Multiplex?
It is, yes.
Could we look at the next 2 pages? Now, I may have got the details wrong. What do you understand that document to be? This is page 1700.
The document I have in front of me is a compensation event claim dated October 2013.
Yes. Now, I've understood that as relating to the space which is being provided for the bone marrow transplant service. And just looking at what it said, the board is confirming proposals, presumably set out by Multiplex.
Yes. My reading of the document would be that this follows on from the point that's been made about conversations continuing after July 13. This would suggest that the board accepted or requested further alterations, and Multiplex agreed to do these additional works for the price. And this is my reading. I'm assuming reading this, given that the Cypro contract manager isn't us, is Multiplex's request for confirmation that we're going to pay this amount for this additional work. So that would infer that we asked for and subsequently paid for further enhancements to this area in preparation for these patients.
Can I put to, and this is just what I'm inferring from the material that is before me, and I'm looking for correction. The document at 1698 is, as I would see it, if we can go back to 1698.
That's it.
An authorization by officers with the necessary authority to do so of payment of a sum in respect of certain works to the space that the bone marrow transplant service is going into. Now, listening to Mr. Jenkins, he did not tell us anything about additional works. The expression that I've noted him as using as he would say that he had 5 or 6 meetings with the project team to define the specification. Now, my note may be inaccurate, but that's how I've noted it. And that would include, for example, pressure differences between spaces and rooms, about which there's no reference in the the document at 1698. Now, the way I've understood things, and I may be entirely wrong, is there was an approach. The authority was given by the board on the basis of a paper presented by Dr. Armstrong. I think I may have got this out of order, but authority was given by officers with the authority to do so to spend this money on locating the bone marrow transplant service. But the purpose of this document was not to completely define exactly what works were required. That was something which, if I followed Mr. Jenkins, he and his colleagues attempted to do in their 5 or 6 meetings with the project team. And I have assumed that whether or not fully informed by these meetings, the project team requested Multiplex to come forward with a proposal. And the document that we see at page 1700 is the board's confirmation of that proposal. But the proposal is not in respect of incremental or additional work, but is in respect of the work which authority was given for in the document at page 1698. Now, that is how I've understood things thus far, and I'm looking for help to see the respect to which that is wrong.
I think perhaps I don't think it differs from the understanding held in the inquiry team. I think what Mr. Calderwood is pointing out, if I'm understanding correctly, is that let's just assume the meetings took place and lots of information was passed on. I'll give you a good example. 10 to 12 air changes required. That's what he says was one of the topics. Now, as he understood it, he wasn't to contact Multiplex.
No.
He was to speak to the project team.
Correct.
So he was not in control of or participant to any communications with Multiplex. But he assumed, having had all these meetings, that there would then be further communications between the project team and Multiplex, and something would then happen. And if I can take an example, maybe you tell me if you think this is realistic. If he comes and he says, I want gold-plated taps, and the project team dutifully writes that down and says to Multiplex, you'll be providing the gold-plated taps, and they say, no way, then he would have been told. That somebody would have come back to him and said, we put your request for gold-plated taps to Multiplex. They don't see why they should do this. It's a bad example, but you see the point I'm making.
I follow the point you're making, yes.
So that what we don't have here, and you don't have, and Mr. Jenkins didn't have, is anything after the meetings, other than he remembers signing drawings, which he then went and told had been destroyed. So take it from me, if you would, please, for the purpose of these questions, that we do not have any detailed communications from the project team pursuant to those meetings, any responses going through the details from Multiplex, or any other documents beyond the ones you've seen.
Well, the point, I'm not disputing that the process would have been iterative, that as each set of conversations resulted in a requirement to change, right? The project team would then communicate with Multiplex about A, the ability to do that, and B, the cost and timescale to achieve it. These two documents seem to suggest that we had at least two sets of instructions to Multiplex to make changes in relation to the HEPA filtration in this document, page 1700, and structurally in relation to the previous document signed by Mr. Best. There could well have been a third document part of this iterative process. The point I'm making is that the board and its legal position with regard to multiplex can only be assessed at the handover in the context of these written instructions. So now, if 4B was to be built to a certain standard, original contract in 2010, 4B and associated areas were to be modified, and there are two documents here that suggest we had entered into arrangement with multiplex to achieve betterment. Put those three documents together, you get the picture of the environmental area that was to be handed over to us in February 2015. The project team's responsibility in February 2015 was to confirm that this, which was a very specialist area, was to the combination of those specifications. The commissioning team, which is Mr. Jenkins and his clinical colleagues, then had to satisfy themselves between March 2015 and June 2015, when the SERBs moved, that the area was fit for purpose. I became aware of the concerns expressed by the infection control team in the summer of 2015 that it wasn't, in their opinion, fit for purpose. And I suppose the point I'm trying to make is, if Mr. Jenkins is saying that in the period between June and the summer of 2015, almost from the get-go, the area was not acceptable, the point I am trying to make is that service should not have moved. There was no need for it to move. It wasn't a building we were knocking down, that the adult bone marrow transplant unit was still there. But my understanding of when I became involved was that the clinical team were in and happy, the infection control team were not. And that resulted, as I have said in my statement, in a series of works and seeking data and seeking information across the UK to try and come to a view as to whether the infection control team's concerns were correct, and if they were, how would we address it? In other words, make the unit acceptable. And we concluded at the beginning of 2016 that the unit was not compliant with the latest guidance for immunosuppressed patients, and that we couldn't make it compliant. Now, they are two, in my opinion, two different stages. That if we conclude now, with the benefit of hindsight, that 4B to its enhanced status was never built correctly, that is a dispute that the board should have had with multiplex in February 2015, or shortly thereafter as we became aware of it. To the extent that even if the unit had been built to the enhanced specification correctly, it was still not compliant by the turn of 2016. We still had to move the patients back out. So to me, the operational considerations are project team's acceptance at handover and the commissioning team's acceptance of acceptability and moving in.
No. I'll need to go back to your witness statement to make sure we're covering everything that you cover. But let me just ask you one pretty broad question, because I think it will help us to understand the conundrum that you and I are now exchanging comments and evidence on. And that is this. One of the reasons why, in due course, it was said that you could not get the specification you needed for a bone marrow transplant unit was that you could not get 10 to 12 air changes in that location. Do you remember that?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. Now, the challenge we are facing here when we're trying to reconstruct things a very long time later is that we do not know why that issue did not emerge in 2013. So in other words, if you couldn't do it, then if Mr. Jenkins is right and he comes in and he says, I want 10 to 12 air changes, and somebody dutifully writes it down, says, thanks very much, write it in the drawings, go talk to Multiplex, and Multiplex look at it and go, no way, you can't get 10 to 12 air changes here given the state of the construction, for whatever reason. Doesn't matter. I'm not looking to get into the contractual debates here.
No.
Then one might have thought that the response to Mr. Jenkins' series of meetings would pretty quickly have been, via the project team, an answer saying, no can do.
I would have expected the same, yeah.
Here is why.
Yeah.
And that would have no doubt have been fed back and debated, and things might have been different. And I don't know whether you can help us as to whether in all your exchanges that you had on this, right through this period until it was still going when you retired.
Correct.
You had any understanding of why this didn't emerge a lot earlier?
Well, I can't say that, well, first of all, from my involvement, I started from the status quo, which is what was 4B at that time, in the context of environment and M&E. And once David Hall had found the English guidance on what is an absolutely ideal environment for these patients, and we compared 4B as was to the specification as required, Multiplex responded that they couldn't achieve that. Now, I'm kind of hesitating here because part of this, that's a factual statement of what I knew. Right. Reading the documentation that has been shared with me, 4B, as originally specified, was to have more air changes per hour than the whole than the generic hospital. And therefore, moving from whatever that number was, which wasn't 3, it was a higher number, to the 10 to 12, at the point I became involved, was said it couldn't be done. I would share your view that if the clinical team had conveyed to the project team, and the project team had conveyed that religiously to Multiplex, that issue would have been back in my desk in the autumn, oblique winter of 2013-14, because the cancer clinicians would not have given up in their expectation of moving.
Okay. I'm going to come to this English guidance because at the moment we here are a little puzzled as to exactly what it was that we were looking at. So I will come to ask you about that, but let me just explain why I'm puzzled, and then we'll pick it up later in your witness statement. The guidance document we've spoken about earlier in your evidence was SHTM 0301. Mm-hmm. Now there is an English equivalent, HTM 0301. And these are documents which, if you may just take it from me, they are, if not identical, very, very similar.
Yes.
As is apparently not unusual. There are tweaks made, but essentially the UK guidance remains similar. and we couldn't see what it was that you had found, or David Hall had found, that was said to be so different. You can't remember what the document was called, do you?
No, I can't, but I think I read something in one of the documents that you sent me last week, which was a note of the meetings and the process, which I believe contained reference to the English document that David Hall had produced.
Okay, well, that might be easier now if we just go back to your witness statement. We'll see what now matters and perhaps what doesn't matter. Please just bear in mind when going through it, if you would, the discussion we've just had about the Jenkins evidence that you didn't know about, which on one view impacts at least the process that's happened. In your witness statement at 154, you say these changes were made instructed by us, paid for by us, carried out by Brookfield. Now, just pausing there, what changes, let's leave in the air for the moment because of the conversation that we've had, because all you knew about was the change order.
Yes.
And then you say there was an impasse between IPC and clinicians. Whether that's your recollection of what happened.
Correct.
Yeah. And then what you go on to say in the next several paragraphs, you're talking about air sampling results and what you tried to find out about air sampling results elsewhere and how difficult it was to get information and so on. And I'm not going to ask you about that because in the bigger picture, perhaps it becomes less critical. But you come, by the time you get to page 47, in paragraph 161, to the stage, in effect, you're saying, you've got a problem, you've had a look at it, but for the moment at least, a decision is made back to the Beatson. Is that correct?
Correct.
And I see you end that paragraph by saying, that's why, was this your decision to go back to the Beatson?
Sorry?
Was this your decision?
It would be, yes.
You say here, I went back to Gartnavel and the view of the doctors was that they were moving from one environment to another that they didn't think was better. Because, just pausing there, am I right in that you thought that what was being provided for the Beatson bone marrow transplant unit would have been equivalent to or better than what they had at the Beatson?
Not put like that. The adult bone marrow transplant unit at the Beatson had been certified as appropriate during its construction in 2006. And it was, as far as the infection control team at the Beatson was concerned, was an acceptable clinical environment. The cancer clinicians would argue, and this is me commenting with hindsight, would argue that by 2016, the Beatson was aging and potentially not the optimal environment. The critical area in this debate was the argument that the cancer clinicians needed access to acute medicine and critical care alongside oncology. We couldn't provide that at Gartnavel, therefore that resulted in the paper to move. When I moved them back, the board had to spend over £1 million a year to create an interim high dependency unit in Gartnavel because you couldn't acknowledge that there was a safety issue clinically and move them back without addressing it. But we couldn't resolve the infection control issue. So I was endeavouring, as I set out in the statement, to try and tabulate the pros and cons of how poor or otherwise was the environment from an infection control perspective versus the rest of these services in Scotland, in the United Kingdom, and specifically within Glasgow at the Beatson. When David Hall produced this guidance that said the optimal specification for these category 3 extremely compromised patients was X, I took the view that you had to look at that as being the new emerging guidance, and therefore the Queen Elizabeth, if it was going to be the new Centre for Adult Bone Marrow Transplant, had to meet, as you know, well, ideally meet those standards. And I was advised that I couldn't achieve that at the Queen Elizabeth at that time. And without being able to reach a compromise where the infection control doctors said, if you do X, we're prepared to accept Y, I then had to negotiate with the cancer doctors to go back and what support did I have to put into the Beatson to make them feel safer at the Beatson while we established a process which took place during 2016, 2017 to come up with a long-term solution to the co-location of adult bone marrow transplant with acute services.
I appreciate this is going back a step, really. Were you ever shown a document which contained what David Hall described as the English guidance?
I cannot recall if he tabled a document or an actual schedule of specification at the meeting. There was a bit of paper, but I don't think it was an actual HTM document.
As Mr. Connell has indicated, we're a bit puzzled by this because we simply do not know of the existence of an English document about this time, other than, in relation to ventilation, other than HTM 0301 and possibly the JACI requirements, which are international requirements. We simply don't know of any other source of guidance. And I just wonder if it's this is an unfair question, really, but I just wonder if it's possible that when David Hall was talking about English guidance, he was talking about HTM 0301 in its 2007 edition.
I don't believe so. I wish I could recall the document I was reading on Monday, where there was a kind of brief note of our discussion in reference to David Hall's producing this schedule. I can't remember which one of the documents was, but it was submitted and taken by me to be what was emerging as the optimal specification for this area. My recollection is that in Scotland, there wasn't at that time a published technical memorandum specifically to stage 3 compromised immunosuppressant patients. And that this was guidance that was emerging in England, that this is what you should achieve. And my view at the time was that if this is what was emerging, and given that we were doing something that was going to be our unit, in inverted commas, for the next 20, 30 years, and we needed to be on the front foot and looking to achieve that. And that debate was what I founded my decision on to move the service back.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Connell.
Okay, I'm going to take you to some of the other stuff you said about this We'll see if it helps. If not, we'll move past it. Can we go to the next page of your witness statement, page 48, and just pick up briefly paragraph 164. Now, you have commented about the aging beats, and I won't bother asking you about that, but I see in 164 you say the ventilation specification was allegedly the same standard as the Beatson, if not marginally better. That is what I was told.
Yeah.
Do you remember who told you that?
Well, that would be a combination of the project team and the clinical team. By that, I mean the managerial clinical team of the clinical team.
Well, I can understand why the clinical team might say, well, we understood the specification to be what we had, but probably a bit better. That makes sense. Do you think you might have been told the same thing by the project team? And if so, by who?
Well, the only people on the project team that I interacted with on a regular basis was the project director and, in essence, the project director, Peter Moyer. They would be the people I speak to. But I come back to the point we discussed earlier. 4B was to be of a certain standard, and I was told it was of that standard.
By who?
By the project team as part of the commissioning process.
Well, because it was never commissioned in its original form. Is that right? Are you talking about once the bone marrow transplant changes had been made?
I'm saying that at February 2015,
right,
when the building was recommended to the airport to take over, and during the period thereafter, when all the services were tested, the environment in Ward 4, the wider environment Ward 4B, should have been tested and signed off as meeting the standards that we had paid for. Now, we have discussed whether we had 1, 2, 3 or numerous variations on that, but cumulatively put together, they would be the specification of when, again. So when I am talking to these people in late 2015, I am starting from the point that you have told me the building is of this standard. Why is it failing infection control? And is it better than the Beatson? And people are saying to me, yes, it is.
And the people who are saying that to you are the project team?
Yes. By this stage, not the project team, they're the operational team in the context of the Director of Estates.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, no, but it is the project director, just he's not.
Yeah.
Just from my note, when you use the term operational team, in conversation with you, latter part of 2015, who do you mean?
Well, the project director, David Loudon, became the board's director of facilities and estates. So on a day-to-day basis, he had oversight of the maintenance. But the point I'm kind of labouring is that if we said the building met our requirements in February 2015, it should have been tested and certified. During the 100-day commissioning period, the clinicians should not en masse, but should have been in and around the environment and testing it as with the infection control team. Therefore, from June 2015 onwards, we have accepted that we got what we paid for from Multiplex. We've moved on. But we've got operational problems occurring, which couldn't be resolved on the ground, and hence it get escalated. The point that Mr. Jenkins is making, and I can't comment because I just have no recollection of it, that from day one the clinicians were concerned that the environment wasn't what they had asked for, is news to me.
risk of maybe just restating the obvious. When you talk about things happening in February 2015, I'm taking that as a reference to certification of completion by Capita.
Correct.
And when you're talking about commissioning over a 100-day period, that is the clinical teams that are going to be responsible for the various services in the various areas of the hospital, satisfying themselves that they've got facilities that are ready to receive patients in June.
Yes.
It's not, they're not going through perhaps a very formal procedure. They're just making sure that they have got what they think they need for the service that they will be providing.
Yes, the commissioning teams, groups, clinical groups, rely at that stage on the confirmation from the project team that the services comply. So if, and I don't know the detail for this, but if Mr. Jenkins or Gary had set out that they needed 10 to 12 air changes, there should have been in the certification log a note that the ventilation plant had been run for a period of time and had achieved within that parameter, i.e. no less than 10 air changes an hour. Now, if you do a test and it doesn't achieve 10 air changes an hour, you would, assuming that's the contract that you've paid for, you would then go back to Multiplex and work with them to rectify why that wasn't occurring. And as I referred to last night, in my time, this would all be just working our way through a rather large lever arch file of certification. And so I can't comment why if indeed that happened, that it didn't perform to the specification. And I would have thought Gary and his team might have asked for and sought that as part of their commissioning to ensure themselves that it was clinically safe.
Oh, is it possible, as I think you suggested a moment or two ago, that so far as services are concerned, because they have a lot of stuff to look at, as far as services are concerned, they may have relied on assurances or an assumption of assurance from the project team that what they were moving into was what they had asked for.
Oh, absolutely, in the sense of the M&E.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think that's the point I was keen to get. Now, I'm now not going to ask you about everything you say in your witness statement about this, in part because we've gone a little off-piste because of change, and in part because some of it may not now make a great deal of sense. But can I just come to, and let me preface my question by saying that we are aware in the inquiry that in between the point when 4B moved back to the Beatson and Mr. Jenkins' options paper, which for your purposes is the end of the trail because you're not a decision taker on that, attempts were made to see if things could be done to make things acceptable. And none of these ultimately produced an answer that was universally acclaimed as correct. So let's leave out the detail of that because in a sense, the unsuccessful attempt to sort it may not matter. Can I just come back to the point that His Lordship was asking about earlier, and that is this English guidance, because I want to put to you one or two documents that are mentioned in your witness statement to see if this helps at all. The English HTM, sorry, go to page 77. That's my fault, I should have taken you there. Now, you say in paragraph 259, we found guidance issued by the English Health Service which set out the standards that should be achieved. And Multiplex and the project team came back and said, you can't achieve that in 4B. And then you explain some of the issues that you were facing. And 260, you referred, I think, to the English HTM. According to my reference, this is Edinburgh Bundle 2 at page 698. It should be on the document list. Before we worry about looking at anything in it, do you remember this being shown to you as the basis for the points you were making?
No, I don't remember.
I'm not going to go through it because if you just take it from me for the moment, that it's pretty common ground that there are no huge differences between this and the Scottish guidance. The reason I mention it at all is that if you have immunocompromised patients, possibly neutropenic ward, depending on whether that's the right definition, a basic provision is 10 air changes an hour.
Yeah.
But you don't know whether that was what was originally intended for this location in 4B or not, 10 air changes.
No, I don't know the detail. I mean, the point that we discussed yesterday, and I think we came to an agreement or understanding, was that the patient profile that was going into 4B back in 2010 was the Ward 7B service from the Southern General.
Thank you.
And the clinical output specification, which was prepared by a member of the project team, we saw last night, and it inferred that infection control input had been achieved. And in the summer...
Let's take this document off the screen if we would. Thank you very much.
In the summer of 2013, the point I'm making is that you start from the 4B specification and you enhance it. Now, if from day one in the summer of 2013, a minimum of 10 air changes was specified in all of the relevant documentation, then there is no issue other than that as a starting point for your instruction to improve 4B. Okay. Now, at no time between the summer of 2013 and when I became involved again in the summer of 2015, did anybody say to me that they didn't specify what was correct for the patients and they didn't get it?
Sorry, no one said to you that
in 2013 they asked for something and didn't get it, and then no one said to me that at commissioning we didn't get what we had asked for.
And this then moves, if we look at page 78 of your witness statement, to a position which you outline in paragraph 263, that what you were being told, this is the rock and the hard place scenario.
Yeah.
You were being told after all this digging around into what happened for whatever reason.
Yes.
That to get the kind of air changes you were asking for, whether it's 10 or 10 to 12 or whatever, you need to put another floor at the hospital.
That's a generalisation, but yes, the volume of plant that would be needed couldn't be accommodated within the space available.
Meantime, you had clinicians who would really quite like to be back in the Queen Elizabeth for all the reasons that were originally set out, and that was your rock and hard place.
Well, yes, because from the health board's perspective, infection, and I've said this in the statement, infection control, we're saying the environment as per their testing regime gave rise to a risk that patients could be infected. Consultants at Beatson were saying that highly acutely ill patients in the Beatson who were receiving chemotherapy could have a major medical relapse during the night, and in the absence of immediate on-site support of critical care, could die. Now, both of these comments were absolutes. Now, they weren't happening in the day-to-day operation, but they were there. So from the board's point of view, there was no right and wrong answer. There had to be mitigation, whichever way we went.
Yeah. Can I just ask you to look, since we've got that page up, at the document referred to in paragraph 265, so that's bundle 3, page 36.
Mm-hmm.
This is something where HPS, Health Protection Scotland, are helping out, because as it's narrated there, the support had been requested because there's focus on the provision of a safe environment, and it's dated December 2015. Now, had you seen this before?
Not at the time, no. Though it fairly accurately reflects the situation.
And so we do. If we just look at this document, we see basically narrative in the background section, and if we go on to the next page, reference to guidance near the top of the page, no single piece of suitable guidance. Interestingly, HPS say UK guidance comes from various sources, including SHTM, HTM, and so on. And some other reference. And then it goes on to consider the various issues. But this is not a document you remember seeing during all the debates that took place.
No.
Can we go on to the next page just to make sure we've at least opened them up? Because a lot of discussion there about positive pressures and HEPA filtration, and you see in the middle of the page, recommended bedroom air changes detailed within SHTM 030110 per hour, and so on, corridors to be HEPA filtered. And I don't think we need to go through all of that, but it's not something you remember looking at.
No, I'm wondering the date of this document.
Well, perhaps it should show on it. Can we
December
go to
2015.
December 2015, I think. Can we go to the next page just to, yeah. And then there are recommendations at the end.
Yeah.
But take it for us, it's December 2015, so it's while there are still ongoing discussions about what is to be done to put it no higher. Perhaps you can help us in one respect. On page 79 of your witness statement, when you got whatever it was you say you got from England, and you say you were light years away from it. Now that's just a figure of speech, but can you remember what it was that you thought was light years away from whatever?
Well, I mean, it's just alluded to in part in that document we've just looked at from HPS about segregation corridors, air changes, just fundamentally the design of the unit needed, in order to comply with that guidance, would need to radically be different than it was.
Okay. Well, let's just, in light of the conversations we've had today, let's just jump ahead to what for you became the end of this process, because you were asked to look at an options appraisal prepared by Mr. I'm saying prepared by Mr. Jenkins, issued by Mr. Jenkins following a group exercise And he's explained who the group was, how they did the scoring, what assistance they obtained, and so on. This came in, I think, just around the time that you were heading towards retirement. Is that right?
Well, the document that you sent me was dated March 2017. Appendix 5 in the document, around about page 22, 23, is actually dated April 2017.
Okay, well, let's just get this up, if we may. Bundle 27, page 15, volume 7, page 158. Do you remember seeing it?
No, I've never seen it. And well, sorry, I've now seen it twice in preparation for this, but I'd never seen it this time. Two comments I would make. One is that, as I say, if you go later on into the paper, and I think I didn't take a note at the time of the page number, but round about page 22, 23, there is one of the appendixes dated April 2017. I would need to see the board minute of the Acute Services Committee to see what discussion took place. I am of the opinion this paper did not go to the board until after April 2017. That this was the paper that Gary was preparing. I've read the document. I personally would have a significant number of questions about it before I would have taken it to the board. I don't think it properly sets out all of the issues that the board should have been aware of. Secondly, again, reading the paper, the board never receives a paper that's got a request for capital but no numbers and no description of what the capital's for. So had I received that paper and discussed it with Gary, I would have sent him away to do significantly more work on it before I would have been comfortable to take it to the board. That said, the options in it I'm aware of because I attended many an evening meeting with the cancer clinicians about their desire to move forward quickly and discussing the only estate that the board had access to into which we could consider creating the proper unit.
It's a slightly unusual conclusion, I think, in this paper, in that, in effect, what it does it not, is suggest that you move back into the new hospital for the moment as a sort of temporary solution.
I can only comment with the benefit of hindsight and how I would have approached this particular thing. I do not think you could put a paper to the board members that talks about temporary without there being a definitive plan that the board has accepted. My expectation would have been that if you concluded clinically that the risks of patients suffering an adverse effect at Gartnavel was materially greater than the risk that they may catch an infection in the environment at Queen Elizabeth. I understand you could come to that view and you could articulate that to the board clinically, led by the clinicians. You would have to provide the board with significantly more background information than this paper has. You couldn't, in my opinion, this is a personal opinion, you couldn't say it's an ad hoc arrangement but not actually outline to the board what the final destination and conclusion is. And you can't ask for an undefined capital sum. Board has to allocate money, therefore it has to know the number, and you can't not have a scheme. Please give me some money and I'll go and do something with it. Now, as I say, had that paper been presented to me, I would have sent them away to do more work on it. I'm not saying I wouldn't have taken it to the board, because the debate was raging between the cancer clinicians, and the board was always going to have to confront this challenge. And this paper starts to allude to the fact that the adult bone marrow transplant environment at Gartnavel was deteriorating.
In paragraph 338 of your witness statement, you say this: you were surprised by the proposed decision, because that's what the paper had in it, to return the bone marrow transplant to the new hospital, as published guidance that you had seen was so black and white that in effect you would have had the board putting BMT patients into I think I'm paraphrasing what you say, you'd been putting BMT patients into a unit that did not comply with the current recommendations for a unit of that kind.
Yeah.
And you found that a surprising conclusion.
I did, yes. But that's a personal comment.
But as you say, the constant has been that the clinicians want to co-locate with everything else that's in the new hospital.
I'm accepting, and have accepted since I became involved in this debate in the autumn of 15, that the board was confronted with a real issue, that the environment, the clinical support environment at Gartnavel was deemed a risk. The physical environment in the Queen Elizabeth was deemed a risk. And a process would have to be entered into to try and, I'm trying to think of a phrase, but that would calculate those two risks and be able to compare and contrast them. Because at my time, there was no movement on the infection control team's views. And in an ideal world, you would have got the infection control teams, the cancer doctors ultimately presenting singularly to the board. And that's why I'm saying I would like to have seen the board minute of the debate, because that would have been the clinching factor, that if the infection control team and the cancer doctors jointly advised the board, then the board could have moved back to the Queen Elizabeth.
I think, unless my lord has further questions about bone marrow transplant, I might leave that topic on. I haven't gone through everything you've said in your witness statement. We have it obviously in writing in any event. Can I ask you about another topic, because it keeps coming up repeatedly, whatever attempts are made to push it back into the backwoods again, and that's what's been described as the Horn Taps saga. Now, the reason I wanted to ask you what you knew about it is that the issue first arose in 2014, so during the build of the hospital.
Yeah.
And it arose because there had been an incident in Northern Ireland involving neonatal deaths.
Yeah.
And recommendations, alerts flowed from that. Now, first of all, were you aware of that?
No.
You weren't aware of the incident in Northern Ireland?
Not that I can recall.
I think sorry.
I was going to say that in the documentation you sent me, the kind of comprehensive note of the meetings that took place between the project team, Health Facility Scotland, Health Protection Scotland, following on from the circulation of the learning from the Northern Ireland incident. And the conclusion of that meeting said that all parties were content with the arrangements that were proposed at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, but that Mr. Powrie, who was in attendance at the meeting, needed to make sure in building the maintenance schedules up that there was a need for a regular 6-monthly action on behalf of the estates team. And that was in the document. So from my point of view, reading that, it appeared to me that we received the recommendations coming out of the Northern Ireland Review. A properly constituted meeting with all of the external parties took place, and they agreed to stick with the, in my words, the status quo. As I said in my statement, had that meeting concluded that the status quo was not the way forward, then because of the costs involved, the project director would have had to have done a report to the board asking for the release of a significant amount of additional funds. So my comment really is, organisationally, we were aware of the Northern Ireland learning. Proper action was taken within the project team. External advice was sought. A conclusion was reached and enacted. I should add, okay, just adding the point that from the conversation we had last night about the estates team knowing and not knowing about how to run the building, Mr. Powrie, as you'll see, was fully involved in the project in 2014.
Well, the first point I wanted to ask was this, and I think you do deal with this in your witness statement. If there were various participants in these discussions who no doubt have brought to these discussions their own thoughts and interests and so on and so forth, and we can only see what's in the notes. If one of the concerns that may have been, at least in the back of the minds of the project team, was that if we have to rip all these things out and basically start again with different taps that don't have flow straighteners, thus eliminating the problem rather than working around it, that'll cost money.
Yes.
Possibly quite a lot of money.
Certainly 7 figures, yes.
So, right, 7 figures. Can you help us at all? Because it's been suggested, or posited at least by some parties, that, well, money was obviously the driver behind the scenes here. They didn't want to spend the money, so they decided to take the cheap route of hoping to deal with it by maintenance. What would have happened if they'd said, no, we can't have money interfere here. Let's go and ask the chief executive for £1 million. Was there money available?
Correct, yes, there was. I mean, this project, as I alluded to and answered some of the questions yesterday, was well funded by the Scottish Government. In our business case, as I think I said last night, we asked for and received authority to get up to £842 million. Our contract with Multiplex, both for the initial works and then the subsequent addition of the multi-storey car park and other bits and pieces, came in below 600 million at the end. At the time of that meeting in 2014, the project would be sitting in surplus of something like £60 million that was available to the board because the government had confirmed that any underspend could be used to accelerate phases 2 of the Queen Elizabeth site redevelopment, which is the teaching and learning centre and the other multi-storey car parks. therefore, I would contend that if the project director had written to me saying that he wished in excess of £1 million to be released to make these changes, and he evidenced the Northern Ireland and he evidenced the meeting with the external experts and the conclusion, I may well have been grumpy about spending money, but the money was there. So I cannot understand how anyone representing the board at these meetings would be saying that money is an issue.
Thank you, Lord. From my Lord's notes, that discussion effectively appears in paragraphs 413 and 414 of this witness statement around the money side of matters. And
Thank
I
you,
see
Mr. Conn.
from the time we're possibly at the break.
Very well. We'll take our coffee break. If I could ask you to be back for 5 to 12.
5 to 12.
Thank you.
Please stand.
Mr. Connell.
Thank you, Lord. Mr. Calderwood, just before I leave the Horn Taps saga, which we touched on briefly before the break, I've been asked to ask you this. How did you, as the chief executive, respond to the warnings that were being issued by senior leaders such as Sir Harry Burns about the Northern Ireland incident and the issue of flow straighteners in taps?
The health board would have received the guidance and any particular Scottish Government directives, and then that would be issued to the operational directors with a requirement that they review whether or not the horn taps were in existence in any of the hospitals and the action needed, and that would have resulted in reports coming back should they have been identified as an issue.
I think, at the risk of repeating the question, that I'm really directing it at what you did, if anything.
Nothing. That kind of communication doesn't come through my office.
So you weren't aware of it until later?
Well, it's two different questions. The issue about the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and the action taken, we've discussed, and I wasn't aware of it at the time because the conclusion was as recorded. The Northern Ireland incident would have been, I have no doubt, raised at the Chief Executive's monthly meeting with the Scottish Government, the Director General, and we would all have been commended to make sure that organisationally the learning was taken on board.
Well, so the communication might not come over your desk, but it would probably be raised in one of your Scottish Government meetings. Is that what?
In the context of a briefing, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it may have been raised.
Assuming that happened, what did you then do about it?
As I said, the organisation would circulate on my behalf the information to all the directors, asking them to check the estate to see whether we had in the operational parts of our organisation any of these taps, and to come back with that audit and the action that we needed to take. And therefore, in the context of this, David Loudon, as project director, would have got that communication in respect of the Queen Elizabeth.
Can I just go back temporarily to a couple of things about Ward 4B, which have dropped up in the interval? What you had in 4B was a group of high-risk patients, just to use that term generally, patients with particular needs for protection. This is the bone marrow transplant group. Given what had been discovered, that problems, challenges, however you want to describe it, had been discovered in 4B, did you ever consider, as chief executive, the man ultimately on whose desk the buck stopped, that you should immediately review what had been provided for other vulnerable patients, such as paediatric oncology?
Not directly in relation to that incident, no. There had been a process in place in regard to the Shahalian, which had been led by the board's medical director, Dr. Armstrong.
Well, I can understand that, but here you've got this shiny new hospital. I mean, we were hearing from Mr. Jenkins that he remembers the decision to move out and go back to the Beatson, partly because it was taken the same day as Her Majesty was opening the hospital, so it sticks in his head. You've got this shiny new hospital. I think the point being put is, in a shiny new hospital, you might not have expected to have had the kind of issue that you had on 4B. And did that not therefore prompt you to say, stop, let's go and check other critical areas? It may be I'm simply repeating the question and you give me the same answer, but if
Yeah, well, no, the position, to answer your question, no, as a consequence of being alerted to the issues with regard to 4B for the new patient profile adult bone marrow transplant and finding that it was deficient to the specification required for that patient group, I didn't then say, hang on, I don't trust everybody else in the hospital to have done their job, therefore I will systematically go through every department and check their work. No.
Can I ask you to look at a document, please, if you would? This is bundle 13, page 840. This is still around 4B, and the reason I'm going here is that I don't want to take the time, because time is short, to go through everything you've said in your witness statement, but there are certainly implications in your witness statement that the identification of issues and the creation of issues was really down to IPC and not the clinicians. Now, this is a paper prepared by Mr. Jenkins, which summarizes events and talks about what was found about testing and so on and so forth. Now, first of all, we see at the foot of the page, following clinical debate, it was agreed on balance of risk, it would be safer to transfer the patients back to the Beatson. Now, this is being written by Mr. Jenkins, not by Dr. Peters. So if we have a look at the top of the next page, page 841, Craig Williams comes back, he joins in, says he concurs. He wants the validation of commissioning units, not surprisingly, along the same lines as you're saying, why don't you just get out the big folder and look at the check sheets in the days of paper? So there's nothing. I suppose my point is, do you accept that in fact the decisions to move were agreed not only by a range of people concerned with IPC but also by clinicians?
Yeah, I mean, I can't. I haven't seen this particular briefing note, but I have no reason to dispute that. My personal recollection was that the cancer clinicians were not particularly happy about the conclusion to move back.
Can I ask you about an entirely different topic, please? And it's one where I think there is particular reason for going there, which we've heard a lot about earlier in the inquiry. So if we just go to your witness statement, please, at page 29. Now, the first question on the top of page 29 is simply because in the course of exchanges about a problem with inadequate resource to do what needed to be done on site after handover, it was suggested to these people like Ian Powery that the management thought that Multiplex would maintain the hospital for 2 years. And that's why, presumably as an excuse for not having adequate budget. And you don't recollect ever thinking that?
Well, first of all, I could not accept that any senior estates manager in the NHS of Scotland could say that he thought a contractor was responsible for maintenance. Defects liability yes. Maintenance, routine maintenance, no.
Right,
That's never
it's not
existed in
suggested
Scotland.
that estates thought that, it's suggested that management thought that.
And who was management in this instance? It certainly wasn't me.
Possibly you, I don't know.
Well, no, I've been involved in enough capital expenditure and contracts over many years to know that maintenance has nothing to do with the contractor.
Now, the next questions, I think, really follow from this, that we've had a lot of evidence that once the hospital was handed over, the estates team were, and I don't think I'm exaggerating by reference to the earlier evidence to say, overwhelmed. There was so much going on between snagging and supervising, contractors coming on, problems with the building, unexpected issues, that they did not have enough people or enough time to do what needed to be done. Now, just take it from me, if you would, for the purpose of my questioning, that is the evidence that we have had, which has been combined with evidence of people routinely working 12-hour days, sometimes 7 days a week, and basically complaining up the line and saying, we need something done, we need more resource. Now, the evidence we've had is that that goes to you, and your answer, which comes back through the line of command, is no more money. You can get no more money for this service. Make do with what you have to do with what you have. Now, am I right in thinking from your witness statement that you don't accept that you were ever asked for that or gave that answer?
Correct. I mean, as I've tried to explain in my witness statement, as chief executive of an organisation the scale of Greater Glasgow and Clyde, one does not have corridor conversations about money. There is a very defined process which budget holders go through. I think, as I tried to set out in my statement, the hospital did not have a budget in its opening first year, 2015, 2016. The board underwrote the actual expenditure incurred. And again, I gave specific examples where, because the performance of the hospital didn't meet the then Scottish executive standards, many of the operational policies that had been put in place had to be rewritten and the costs associated with them increased. I have evidence portering domestic nursing staffing. So the process in 15-16 was very fluid. There was no set budgets. Going into 2016-17, the hospital moved into the same budget setting process as every other clinical facility in Greater Glasgow and Clyde. The board receives the allocation from the government. Board then passes through to the operational units those budgets that are earmarked for them or those budgets that are approved. So approximately 45% of the board's budget goes to the health and social care partnerships, and the balance goes to the responsibilities board discharge. That is then distributed through the chief operating officer. It's then split over the directors of the various hospitals, and the director of estates and facilities gets a budget. He, in this case it was a he, splits that between catering, portering, domestic, estates, etc. The budget process is quite straightforward. If the estates department on the Queen Elizabeth site put forward a case explaining what they need, that goes to the director of estates. He would be expected to look across the totality of his budget and decide whether he can move money from one budget to another. If that is not practical, he would go to the chief operating officer to see if there were funds within the acute division that could be transferred to estates within the acute division. And then failing that, a paper would go to the board of director of finance, setting out the reasons and the value of the request. The board at that stage doesn't hold funds. All the board's funds have been allocated to the directors, but the board does have usually what we call development funds for new schemes, and we have what you would call slippage within them. They would be budgeted to say start in July, but might not start to September. Therefore, in that year, there would be what we would refer to as slippage, and we could make allocations non-recurrently to deal with a problem. So that process was never followed, and therefore I have no recollection of or evidence that anyone ever came up. But it would not come up to me as just a, can I have X for the Estates Department at the Queen Elizabeth?
Well, I don't think we know the form in which it came to you, but
It didn't come to me.
we've had a number of witnesses saying either that was sent all the way up to the chief executive and the answer was no more money, or being told that was what had happened. But you're adamant that you weren't aware of this.
I am adamant I was never requested for funds for estates within the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital.
Were you aware of complaints that the estates team did not have the money or people to do the work that they needed to do
No,
in the new hospital
no,
at all? You've never heard of this?
no.
Mr. Calderwood, in the description you gave, am I right in understanding that you were simply not part of the structure you went through whereby additional funding could be requested by a particular director?
I personally had no budget, other than the budget headings that had been allocated. So for something to come to me, it would be the board director of finance would come to me to say that there was an operational issue, and we would debate where, if at all, we could divert funding. But that is the word, divert funding. There's no extra funding.
Right. So maybe I didn't pick up correctly what you'd said. So there was the possibility
Correct.
that you and the Director of Finance might decide, if you could find the funds, to allocate funds to a particular demand.
Correct.
Right. Sorry. Right. I hadn't picked up correctly what you'd said. Sorry, Mr. Conn.
No, the reason I'm pursuing this point, I think, needs to be made clear to you that if you take, well, let me give you two examples. One is the DMA Canyon report, which was received about water safety.
Yes.
Not actioned, as it should have, in the way it should have been.
And as I inferred yesterday, my understanding retrospectively is that 80% of the cost of dealing with the DMA Canyon report would have been picked up and funded by Multiplex.
Yeah. Well, my point was simply, just let me finish that particular question, that having interrogated a number of the participants in that process in one way or another, the general thrust of what the more junior people said was we were all grossly overworked. Yes, we should have done X or Y, and things just didn't get done because we were all too busy. So you can understand why it's of importance to a number of the participants in the inquiry to find out what you, as the chief executive, was at least nominally responsible for the whole exercise, knew about it. You understand
I
that?
didn't know about it. And again, I have to stress not knowing who is saying what. In the period from June 2015, when the building was fully operational and under the responsibility of the board, and therefore in this particular example, the Estates Department, there was no definitive budget set for the 2015-16 year. I have emphasised on numerous occasions the excess funds that existed within the scheme. Therefore, in the period 2015-16 up to March 2016, I would dispute any issue about resources being a restricting factor. From April 2016, the hospital was the same as every other part of the board. We were under annual, what was called cash releasing efficiency saving targets set by the government. They were part of every year. So in April 2016, the board's director of estates would have received a budget allocation which would be based on the money received by the board, uplifted by the money given by the Scottish Government. The real costs that he or she might be facing could be significantly a variance to that, but that would have to be achieved by efficiency savings. Right.
So I was going to ask you a separate question about that, if I can. Can we just come back before you went on to the Scottish Government's efficiency?
Well, the point I'm trying to make, sorry to interrupt, but the point I'm trying to make is that debates after April 16 need to be looked at in the context of routine board business. The period, and due reference to DMA Canyon report, in the period, just to take that as a practical example, there was no financial restriction to get that done. None at all. And I would dispute any of my colleagues saying that that's why they stayed awake at night in that period. After that, then they would join the period of all the directors in dealing with the challenging rising costs of the service versus a fairly static cash budget. So in the period after April 16, then I am no doubt the Estates Department, like every other department, was faced with challenges.
Okay. Well, let me just take that point then, since you've gone back to it. The way it has been presented to us is that the junior people complain, their managers complain, it goes up the chain. People who know of these complaints try to intervene to see if they can assist, and the answer comes back, nothing can be done. We can't get any more resource for you. Do what you can. And then, because that's the picture I've already painted for you, and then going into the next year, they're told, well, you know, these resources that you were telling us were not adequate to do it, half the work you needed to do. Well, we've just been told we have to cut the staff numbers. And is that the efficiency savings you're talking about? Efficiency
savings are implemented by the directors as they see fit. Sometimes it's relatively straightforward. You mechanise a function, and therefore you get the efficiency out of investing in new plant and equipment. In other services, it can be that you redesign the tasks so that they can be performed differently. But in real terms, cash releasing efficiency savings are that. Now, cash releasing efficiency savings are not cash taken out of the system. They are generated by the difference between the uplift. So if you receive a 2% uplift on your allocation, but the wage rises that year are negotiated at 3%, then you have to find the 1% difference between your uplift and your costs. And directors each year submit these proposals to the board as part of the budget setting exercise. Now, the point I'm making is in the budget setting exercise for April 16, Mr. Loudon would have been expected to bring forward all of the challenges as he saw them, all of the cash that he expected to receive versus what he thought his costs would be. And he would work through that process with the board's director of finance. And where major change was being proposed in order to affect the service being delivered within budget, that is reported to the board each year round about June or July when the budget setting exercise. So I need to differentiate between 15-16, where there was, in my opinion, no budgetary pressure on the Queen Elizabeth, as distinct from other parts of the business. And then business as usual, as I would refer to it, from April 16 onwards. And I do not recall in the papers that went before the board in April, well, for the year April 16 to March 17, there was any statement that maintenance staff posts were being cut.
The other reason I wanted to ask you this now was that the decisions that were taken on Horn taps were dependent in terms of effectiveness on a particular maintenance regime being put in place, which we've heard from other witnesses involved thermal disinfection, as it were, in a separate location at a particular level. And we've had all the details of that. Now, by the time what's subsequently been known as the water incident happened in 2018, after your time, that wasn't in place. Why? Because estates didn't have the time and resource to get it done, although they knew it was supposed to be done. That's at least what this inquiry has been told. So you can understand why those who are concerned about patient safety see a tap which is causing risks, if not maintained properly, not being maintained, and say, well, why are we in a hospital where there isn't enough people to do the work? And ultimately, I suppose it's just perhaps surprising that there seems to have been this upswell of concern at the time, no proactive maintenance being done. People were just doing firefighting, struggling to get that done. Asset tagging, as you know, hadn't been done properly anyway. So all of the things they wanted to do were not being done. And you basically say you knew nothing about this at all.
Not in the period that that we are discussing, and certainly not in that detail. I would have to say that all patient safety issues, if I was the director of estates on the Queen Elizabeth site, would be the first charges I would make to any budget I had. Bearing in mind, budget holders have the discretion on how they spend their money. These are so the director of estates will receive a multi-hundred million pound budget. He then dispenses that to budget holders. Mr. Powry, as the sector estates manager on the Queen Elizabeth site, would get a multi-million pound budget. He would decide how he spent that.
Can I just, I apologise for being slow on this. If we look at the period from handover in June 2015 until the next financial year begins in April of 2016, when you say that, and we're talking about estates, when you say that estate had no budget, does that mean that the director of estates could simply spend essentially what he considered appropriate or necessary, or is it a little bit more complicated than that?
It's a little bit more complicated in that sense. When I say there was a staffing establishment agreed with agreed by the estates directorate in staffing the Queen Elizabeth. So staff transferring to the hospital from the closing hospitals, the Victoria, Southern General, Western Infirmary, etc., they would apply for and be appointed to posts within an established workforce. So the workforce, numerically, had been set out in setting the budget, the indicative budget for 2015-16. Because of issues in the first year of any new facility, and in light of changing practice, the board constantly revisited the resources that were allocated to the Queen Elizabeth campus to respond to these issues. So a new nurse staffing regime came out which reflected that our original assumptions about nurse staffing for single rooms was wrong. And we had to increase the number of whole-time equivalent nurses per 32-bed ward because the layout of the single rooms and the tasks that had to be repeated was not reflected in the staffing numbers. Likewise, and I think I referred to it in my statement, when we opened, we applied the same domestic services schedule to the Queen Elizabeth we used in every other hospital in Glasgow. Infection control doctors i.e. the new infection control officer appointed for the Queen Elizabeth, deemed that single rooms could not be cleaned that way. They had to be cleaned 100% on the discharge of one patient before the next patient can get in. That resulted in the domestic workforce having to be increased so that the domestics were on duty all the time to clean the rooms as patients were constantly being admitted and discharged. Likewise, portering was deemed to be causing a problem in the A&E department of not being able to move the patients quickly enough. And as the hospital wasn't performing to the Scottish Government targets, we had to increase the portering budget. So it was an iterative and dynamic process in 15-16. But the point I'm trying to make in the States is that there was access to significant non-recurring money to make sure that all of the issues in 15-16 were addressed. In 16 and 17, the financial discipline that the board was under was applied to every budget holder. The board did not take individual decisions as to whether the Royal Infirmary should get X for maintenance versus the Queen Elizabeth, or whether the Victoria and Stobhill hospitals should get Y compared to the Queen Elizabeth. That was a professional judgment of the Estates Directorate. And therefore, to ask for more, you have to go through the process of saying why you cannot move the money about within your own areas of budgetary responsibility.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering about this business of there not being a budget initially, because we have had some evidence that has actually identified why the resources were inadequate, because the assumption was made that by moving from I'm paraphrasing, by moving from a number of old hospitals into a nice shiny new one, you'd be able to do things with less people, among other things. And then it turned out that all the new systems weren't working properly and so on and so forth. And certainly initially, it seems to have been.
Yeah, I mean, but the point I'm making is that the establishment, the manpower, was set out by the Estates Directorate and therefore funded by the board. Right. The supplies expenditure, in other words, the DMA Canyon report is an example of a one-off cost, right? There were funds available to do that, and there were responsibilities in particular between us and Multiplex as to what was a defect and what was routine maintenance. To the extent that the Estates Director at the Queen Elizabeth disagreed with the staffing establishment or the supplies budget, would, as I'm trying to point out, require to be a very documented process whereby he would set out his arguments for more. That would be received up through the management chain to the Director of Estates. If he agreed with the request and then couldn't find the resources within his own budget, he would speak to the Chief Operating Officer to see if there were other funds. And the point I'm trying to make is it would never be a corridor conversation with me, because I don't have funds. The board doesn't hold a budget. 100% of what the board receives on the 1st of April goes out of the board to the budget holders on the 1st of April.
And even if it's not budget related, if I understand your evidence correctly, the fact that there was what's been described to us at least as a real issue about getting things done because of pressure on resource, as a problem, never mind a budget, didn't come to you either.
No.
Can I ask you briefly about one or two other topics? We've kind of touched in passing on other topics on this question of what should have happened at the point of handover, commissioning, whatever you want to call it.
Well, maybe we should pick a word.
Well, you had, I think, at one point said, and tell me if I'm misremembering it, that from your experience of doing project work or being involved with projects, you would have expected that at the point when the building is moving from the builder to the client, there would be, in old terms, a big folder with all the certification of what the systems were, what they achieved, and so on, so on, and so forth.
Yeah.
That's what you would have usually expected. Leaving aside whether things are digitized or not, it doesn't matter for the purposes of my question. Would you have expected that material to be available at the point of handover of the new Queen Elizabeth Hospital?
Yes.
Did you ever try to find out about that?
No. I received assurances from the project director that everything was in order to proceed, and then, as I'll explain, that process was then repeated by the individual directors, advising me of their decision that the building was acceptable for clinical services.
So the persons who would have the access to the kind of information that we've just been discussing, would you expect that to be what was on day 1 or day 100, the project team, day 101, the estates director?
Yes.
And who did you get assurances from, just so we're absolutely clear about it?
The report to the board to accept handover of the building was prepared by the project director, David Loudon, which resulted in us moving to accept the building in February 2015. The work between February and May and June of 2015 to move clinical services in was coordinated by the Chief Operating Officer through the commissioning schedule. And I've already alluded to the budget that was set aside, some 15-16 million pounds, to double staff and double run the new hospital alongside the existing hospitals for the period March to June 2015.
Are you familiar with the difference between, the technical difference in ventilation system terms between two terms? One is commissioning, the other is validation.
Yes.
So what I want to ask about is validation. Our understanding, and again, I'm paraphrasing complicated documents, is essentially that the commissioning means that the contractor tests all his kit, makes sure the buttons are working and the air is coming through and so on and so forth, in the way that he thinks is correct. And then validation is instituted by the client, in this case the board, usually by getting somebody, external specialist, to do a test and basically see whether they're getting in the ventilation systems what they thought they should have been getting.
Yes.
Now, have you any knowledge of validation being done at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital?
No, I have no detailed knowledge of that. I had the assurance of the project director, and the validation was in the main through processes set up with CAPTA.
If you were told, as I think is now common ground with the board, that validation was not done, would that surprise you?
Well, it would have been a serious error and deviation from the protocols that we would have expected, and it would have been something that I would have expected the project director to report to the board. And why?
I'm just wondering, I mean, I can understand if you're in contact with Mr. Loudon and he says to you, all good to go, everything's fine, everything's done, safe to move in, whatever phrase he uses. if that's said to you, given the possible importance of some of these systems for patient safety, are you not looking for something a bit more than a verbal reassurance?
I think I've kind of tried to explain that as the chief executive of the organisation, I was not personally hands-on on every aspect of the board's business, and I was not hands-on in relation to the building and subsequent commissioning of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. Therefore, I relied on the reports that went to the board, and I relied on the reports that were given to me between my direct reports and me. Therefore, if you're asking me, did I second guess and double check everybody else's homework? No, I didn't, and never would have expected to.
Did anybody check what Mr. Loudon was apparently saying? If I was you were aware.
I have no idea whether the Chief Operating Officer or any other director, as part of the commissioning, sought information from David Loudon. But David Loudon, in the role that he was in, was one of the top 10 directors on the board, both in financial terms and in status. So, no, he was subject to performance management system as anybody else, but he wasn't.
So does that mean if Mr. Loudon says it's happened, no one would think to say, well, that's very interesting, David, but can you show me the validation certificate for Ward 2A, for instance?
Well, I think we did. Well, first of all, the answer is that I expect a lot of people might have asked him questions, and I certainly, if I was a director taking over responsibility for my clinical environment, I would have expected to get some detailed information from it. If I was the director, we've already seen in the context of some of the discussions with infection control doctors, they asked the project team to provide documented evidence. So yeah, I suspect, or I would have expected there to be a fairly regular dialogue between the operational team and the project team in the run-up, over the three and a half months or so in the run-up.
The only reason I asked that particular question was, and I'm afraid that the fault is mine, but at least one witness, when asked, well, given what you'd found on site, you're being told that everything had been done, would you not have said to Mr. Loudon, well, I know what you say, David, but would you mind giving me the certificates? And the answer was, I wouldn't deign to challenge what someone at that level told me. Now, is that an acceptable attitude if that's what happened?
Well, I can't comment on what happened because I have no knowledge of what happened. I'm saying that if I had been in that operational role, I might have been more demanding of getting access to the information I thought was pertinent.
When you talk about the operational role, is this the Chief Operating Officer or?
It would be a combination of the Chief Operating Officer and the individual directors of the services. So in relation to Children's Hospital, I would have expected Mr. Hill to have been seeking relevant information for him to discharge his duties. We've already spoke this morning about Mr. Jenkins and the role that he would have been performing in the relation to the adult bone marrow transplant and other regional services. Miss Hartness in relation to the general elements of the Queen Elizabeth Hospital.
Just my failure in noting. Just a moment or so ago, you say during the period, this is the 100-day as
Commissioning,
as I would understand it, you would have expected dialogue between the project team, and I just failed to note.
And the operational teams, the incoming clinical teams.
Right.
But I was inferring that it would be at the kind of managerial level.
Right. People like Gary Jenkins.
Yes.
Right. Sorry, Mr. Conn.
Okay. Can I ask you another? I'll move from validation for the moment. I think you probably understand, Mr. Calderwood, that other participants in the room are also raising questions, not all of which I've got round to yet. Now I'll have to come back to some of these topics, no doubt. Can I ask you something else? Applying a little bit of hindsight for the moment, we know that Ward 2A, the Shahalian unit, was ultimately subject to a major piece of work, long after you had gone. Now, the information we have suggests that questions about the protective environment in the Shahalian unit were being raised right from 2015 onwards on various topics. Are you aware of that?
When I was asked the question the first time in my interview, I'd said I had no recollection of that. I subsequently was shown an email from Dr. Armstrong to a number of staff, which was copied to me, referring to the work that she was taking forward with the operational team about concerns about the environment in 2A. I've gone back over in my mind trying to remember all of those issues, and the answer is yes. I was briefed by Jennifer that there were some concerns raised again by infection control, and as a consequence of which the paediatric bone marrow transplant service was suspended for a number of months while Jennifer and the team sought to resolve the issues that had been raised, and subsequently the board was advised that the paediatric bone marrow transplant programme had recommenced following resolution of the issues. But I wasn't involved in the detail of those issues.
Yeah, just for His Lordship's notes, your initial response to that, which was, I didn't know anything was wrong with Shahalian. I only found out it was wrong since I got involved in this process. I was not aware in 2015, appears in paragraph 79 of your witness statement. That's the point that you've just referred to. I suppose that the kind of broader question is, here's your shiny new hospital. You've got the 4B issue we've dealt with from 2015, so pretty early on. You're then discovering another issue about protective environment. Now, whether you're hands-on with the detail, which we accept you're not, does that not suggest some form of failure of management oversight, if I can put it as generally as that you ended up in this situation on your watch?
Well, I think you have to kind of look at it in 2 points. That the way that the issues were being presented to me in 2015 was that we had received the physical environment with the M&E services that we had specified, but that it was unacceptable to the infection control team.
Well, just pause there. That you'd got the physical environment that was expected for the BMT and associated cohort in 2A. You were being told that.
Yeah, I was never told we didn't.
But you were told, I thought you said you were being told that you did have that.
Yes, the point I'm trying to make is that all the starting points where I became involved in started from, we've got what we asked for, but it's not good enough. And the issue is, why is it not good enough? And what are we going to do about getting it good enough? You've inferred with benefit of hindsight, clearly with the benefit of hindsight, some 10 years later, it would appear that in certain areas we did not get what what we had asked for. But in no discussions with me did they start from, we haven't got what we asked for, because the involvement then would have been entirely different and would have involved using the legal processes through the contractual agreement to go back to square one. Now, to the extent that the board's processes for validation have proved, with hindsight, perhaps not to have been as robust as they should have been, and not as robust as they were made out to be, I can only comment on that with hindsight.
Well, I want to avoid, if I can, getting into a discussion with you which focuses on the contractual provisions with the contractor, because that's not something that's within this inquiry's remit.
No, but sorry, it's very important that if in June 2015, when the decision was taken to move the Children's Hospital from York Hill, and this is exactly the same point I made about the adult bone marrow transplant, if the clinical environment was not that we had specified and, in inverted commas, paid for, and therefore was not safe for the patients, the service should not have moved. There was no requirement to shut York Hill one weekend and only one weekend. We could have delayed the move for a period of time. The second point I'm trying to make is that if that had been the issue that had been flagged, the resolution process is entirely different. You can't, if the environment is not right, you cannot resolve that issue in situ. You have to deal with it differently. I was confronted with an issue where we were told the starting point was fine, but the new team think it's not good enough.
Who articulated that to you in that way?
I couldn't name or point to an individual. It was just the general gist of the conversations that were presented to me before I became involved.
So would I be right in thinking that on the basis of the information you had, no one was suggesting that Multiplex had not provided what had been specified?
No, that never came up in the conversations.
And did it, or did the conversation include a question as to whether what had been specified was what should have been specified?
That was more of the tone of the conversations I were involved in, which was, had we made a mistake by not getting state-of-the-art accommodation? And if so, why had we done that? Or was it a case of the infection control team applying different standards in 2015 to that we had applied during the design process in 2010-11? And therefore, what was the basis for that? And trying to come to an understanding of these issues. And the point I'm really trying to make is that there's two, from where I was sitting, there are two entirely different ways of resolving or seeking to resolve the issue, depending on your starting point. And my understanding of both issues, 4B and 2A, was the starting point when they were being discussed in 2015, was what we've got was what we asked for, but it's not good enough.
Would I be wrong to detect in your statement a sort of flavour that the infection and prevention control doctors in 2015 were looking for more than had been properly specified? In other words, there was a sort of element of changing the goalposts.
My
Now, my question is, would I be wrong to read your statement as including that sort of flavour?
No, I think that's a fair reflection, my lord. My attempt was to understand why the environment was not acceptable. And that started from the premise that we had properly specified what we needed and had been given what we specified. And at that time, there was an element that thought the new infection control doctors who had not been part of the earlier process were perhaps applying different standards. And the question was, how do we address those concerns? A, practically, or B, were they just to be noted? So in relation to 4B, as I said, and we've discussed already this morning, they went back to the beats, and in relation to Shahalian, Dr. Armstrong reported to the board that the service had started again because the issues had been resolved.
Obviously, all of these issues depend on precisely what perspective you're applying to them. But I'm just keen to start by looking at what you thought was to be provided in the Shahalian unit. Now, you go to 64 of your witness statement. I think you say, after a description of process, you say it was front and centre part of the design of the new hospital. Shahalian was front and centre right at the foot of the page. It should have been, and go on to page 65. I was advised it had been designed involving all of the appropriate clinical people and was to a significantly higher standard than York Hill. So am I right in thinking that whatever the debate about IPC or not, what you thought should have been sitting in the new hospital was something better than they'd had at York Hill?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Shahalian was Scotland's only, and is Scotland's only, paediatric bone marrow transplant unit. And that was the service in York Hill in 2009 when we sought to procure the new children's hospital. And that's why I say it's front and centre. It was to be the Scottish National Centre, and it needed to comply with all appropriate regulations and, to the best of our ability, to be as future-proofed as possible.
Who told you it'd been designed involving all the appropriate clinical people?
The project director and the chief operating officer as part of the on-the-go process.
We've had evidence from Dr. Gibson that neither she or not anybody she knows saw the clinical output specification, which surprised us. Does it surprise you?
Well, you're telling me that I didn't know that she'd said that. That does surprise me. I had been referred to, or a comment had been made about the number of meetings that was held, which copies were kept and the participants recorded, which included doctors.
Sorry, could you just repeat that last sentence, including the...
Sorry, that meetings, regular meetings had been held during the design phase, and that the minutes of these meetings had been kept, and the participants included a number of the medical clinicians from York Hill had been at these meetings in signing off the design.
Yeah. Well, if we, just so we don't get at cross purposes, it's probably my fault. What I was asking, remember we were talking about clinical output specifications as part of the employer's requirements, such as we saw for original 4B. We asked about the clinical output specification for 2A.
Yes.
Shahalian showed it to Dr. Gibson, and she said, hadn't seen it, and I don't know anybody who did. I think it's been written by a manager. So would that surprise you? It
would surprise me that clinical staff hadn't seen it. The initial work on the children's hospital, as I referred to in my statement, was led by Dr. Morgan Jimison, who was a cardiothoracic surgeon.
I think if we go to the next stage, which is the design process, I think we know that clinicians, among others, participated in lots of meetings about layout and other issues. Although in relation to the Shahalian, were you aware that Dr. Gibson declined to sign off the plans for the Shahalian because she was very unhappy with what was being provided?
I've never heard that, no.
And basically she was told by the project team in what I might suggest are fairly dusty terms, tough. That was the impression she got. You've not heard that before?
No. One of the documents you sent me included a reference to Dr. Gibson clearly stating that the facilities at the Royal Hospital for Children were significantly superior to that she was leaving behind at York Hill. I understand that she may have more recently reversed that statement.
I think I'd like to be reminded of that statement.
I'm not sure what that
attributed to Dr. Gibson or Professor Gibson.
Professor Gibson. So when we were looking for the plans to see who'd signed them off, we couldn't find a sign off for 2A, and Professor Gibson said she didn't sign it off, or if she did, which she didn't remember, she was pressed to do it. But beyond that, I'm not aware of a statement saying that she got a better result. I think she has stated in the context of the refurbished.
No, this is in the document you sent me last Wednesday to read in preparation for my attendance yesterday today, which I read on Monday when I came back from holiday. There was clearly in those documents a minute of a meeting back during the design process and the commission process, which Dr. Gibson made that statement. I'm not making any comment, it's the document you sent me. But the point, I don't know the detail of the process who would sign off, but basically sending the drawings back to Multiplex signed off by saying they're acceptable to the client, that could well have been a managerial process or through the project team. I don't know to what extent you would expect a practicing clinician to sign off an operational, a practical drawing. And
yeah. Well, perhaps this would be an appropriate point to pause, my lord. We can always check what that document was, because it's not one I confess I'm familiar with. Can I just put the last point, perhaps, in case we can move from the Shahalian point? Your assumption was you were getting, the best you could get because of the role that the Shahalian unit played in Scottish medical care.
correct.
And that's what you would have expected to get.
Correct.
So leave aside what was contractually demanded or anything else. That's what you were looking for, and that's what you would expect your team to be looking for.
Absolutely.
But you weren't aware, other than in exchanges with Jennifer Armstrong, that there was any issue with it.
No, as I explained, the issue that was explained to me by Jennifer Armstrong in the context of suspending the paediatric bone marrow transplant service was that there had been issues raised by the infection control team with regard to the environment and the risk that would pose to these patients. And work was being taken forward to resolve those issues. They were subsequently resolved, and the report back was that the paediatric bone marrow transplant service had restarted.
That was the last question I wanted to ask before lunch, Malone.
Well, we'll take a lunch break and could I ask you to be back for 2:05?
Certainly.